Another thing I notice when I look at the graphic is that all the skin tones of all the people featured in the graphic are white. And we know that whiteness is often perceived to be neutral. If it's white, it has no value. And we know very well now, the way that culture works, that whiteness can be very powerful, it can be very invisible, despite the amount of power, even because of the amount of power that accrues to whiteness as a racial category. What we see if we look closely at the graphic is that everybody appears to have the same skin tone, which begs a reading, invites a very certain narrow kind of reading, I think, which is that if only we could take away those religious markers, the yarmulke, the turban, the hijab, if we could take those things away, we would all be the same. And I think that's a very naive view. I think it's a kind of child's eye view of the world. If we just take away these things, we'll all be the same, we'll all be equal. And I think if multiculturalism, I know that's something that's not popular to talk about right now in terms of the framing of this charter, if we think about multiculturalism in its positive sense, there's certainly been a very long-standing critique of the idea of multiculturalism. One of those things is that we should embrace difference, not deny difference, not suppress difference. And I think that's something that's coming through very strongly in the graphic, is if we would take away these apparently trivial differences in terms of dress code associated with religious affiliation, we'll all be the same underneath. And I think that's a really faulty way of thinking about difference in culture.
Oh, yes, the ban on wearing the kippah, the ban on the turban, you know, all of these things are actually a way of keeping that, the demands, the supposed demands of the minorities down. They're a way of saying, we put up with difference up to this point, but we're not going to anymore, right? Either you become like us or get out of here.
These ways of dividing the religious and the secular are fundamentally Christian in their origin. I think it says something very interesting about, of course, what is hidden underneath the larger impulse of this law, which is to preserve the norm of Quebec's largely Christian society, which is a Christianity that is disavowed in many ways as being the mark of what was dangerous about our past, and yet this sort of, the very thing that's disavowed, of course, is precisely what is made normative and uncommented upon. So crucifixes get a pass, kippahs don't.
There is no groundswell of popular concern in Quebec that the state is no longer neutral, right? It simply has not happened, right? There is no chronology of complaints about not being treated fairly or about unfair bias. There is no groundswell of turning to religiosity in Quebec. It's a thoroughly secular environment and society, and there are a myriad of forms of participation in religious practice, but there has been absolutely no indication of any change that would warrant any particular kind of special debate or special attention that this charter introduces.
One of the things that comes out of this assumption is that there is something called religion that can and should be detached from its outward material manifestations, and that it's the duty of citizens, and in particular agents of the state, to separate their inner conviction from their outward manifestation. This may be a strategy available in some contexts for some religious actors, but it is hardly a universal precept. For one thing, we can all point, and the government and its proponents of the Charter have repeatedly pointed out that there are many Muslims who do not, those Muslim women who are faithful, who do not wear a hijab. There are many Jews who do not wear a kippah. I happen to be one of them. And many other examples of Christians who do not wear ostentatious large crosses and so on. But the assumptions that somehow that religious conviction is essentially this immaterial inner property of the self that not only can but must be separated out from its outer material manifestations becomes again another way in which the state calls upon itself to define the field of the secular, whatever that may be, to define the field of secular as this realm that somehow is evacuated of all these signs, and in so doing it actually defines what religion is in the same breath. To declare that religion and religious affiliation are simply matters of internal conviction, and any other expression, any material manifestation of religious activity is somehow a violation of that essential definition.
I think it's important that the language of neutrality hasn't borne out actually in the responses to the Charter. Those people who support the Charter, in fact, have used language that is far from neutral in defending it. And so when the Jeannettes use words like crazy or manipulated, or they talk about the horror or the being disturbed by being meeting in a government office with a woman who's veiled, the justification of a language of neutrality actually covers over some very affectively charged hate speech. And so who gets to be neutral and then through that neutrality use hate speech against other people highlights the ways in which discomfort marks the privileged citizens of Quebec from those people who are seen as disruptive.
I mean, I think the other strange thing that happened with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, if I can just go back to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, was the use of the term reasonable accommodation. And again, it's the human rights lawyer Pearl Eliadis who made a statement at the time back in 2007 that the use of the term reasonable accommodation actually comes out of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. And it's supposed to be a legal instrument to ensure that people with physical disabilities would have a reasonable form of access to buildings or other types of public transportation in the public sphere. Essentially what happened in the Bouchard-Taylor Commission with the appropriating of reasonable accommodation as a term is it became prescriptive, and it also became about social practices. And now it's stuck. I mean, at the time it was 2007, it's like, why are they even using the term reasonable accommodation? And now it's stuck in our, 6 years later, we're still talking about accommodation. And so even the term accommodation sets out a certain structure of relationships between who is considered to be the dominant culture and who are the, late arrivals, let's say, that somehow have to be the ones that adapt themselves or assimilate in some way, silently and without being noticed in any kind of manner, in Quebec society.
In a way, the proposed charter is an extension, right? It's a continuation of that way of framing a question, right? Or that way of framing the debate. And so by essentially asking us to consider what it means to participate in Quebec society, beginning from the point of a reasonable accommodation, what we see is that we're already talking about a presumed place, a presumed coherence of some pre-existing society, some pre-existing stability that in some way is being valued especially highly, and that is being contaminated by some force, some elements that are in some way apart from and at odds with that imagined coherence. So this is where we have to think of things like Raymond Williams' concept of selective tradition, right, where he says that, you know, all of the things that we think of as a tradition, right, as a kind of naturalized historical shared features in cultural life, that in fact they're only ever at best a selective tradition. That is, that there are other forces that are facilitating the continuation. And when you see continuation of those practices and ideas and sensibilities and artifacts, and the important thing for the critic would be to identify, well, what are those forces that are facilitating the continuation of certain features against others, right? So it's only ever selective tradition, right? It's only ever a partial representation, right, of where a people have been and where they're going.